Hi, I'm Melissa from the Yarn Barn, and today let's talk about weaving in tails. First, we'll talk about just the basic way to weave in a tail, and then 2 techniques to make it a little bit less visible. All right, so first let's do the tail where you finished a color and you're ready to switch to a different color. So we're just gonna cut this. I usually leave between 1 and 2 inches. Shorter if it's something that's set very closely in a fine yarn, longer if it's something like this that is set a little bit more loosely. So then you just tuck it back into the shed that you used for your last pick. Now, you don't want to just put it straight back in because then it's not going to catch the last thread. So manually take it around the outermost thread, then bring it back into that shed and beat it down. And then you're ready to start your next pick. Since we wove in the tail here, for the next shed and the next color, we're going to weave the tail in on this side. So I put it in, and then you have a choice. You can either do what you did here and just put it in the same shed. Again, bring it around the outermost thread and then just tuck it in. Or what I typically do is I go to the next shed, tuck this in this next shed, and then bring the next pick over. I think that seems like it's a little bit more secure. Either one works though. So that's the basic weaving in of tails. And I've put the tails on opposite sides, so I'm not stacking them one on top of the other, which is more visible. But that's the basic version. Now there are 2 ways you can make this less visible. So the first one is to taper the tail. So let's go back and look and see what that looked like. So to make a slightly less visible tail, what you want to do is unply the yarn for about 2 inches, let's say. And again, it can be shorter if this is a fine yarn that's set closely. But for this yarn, we're going to do like this. So we're going to cut one of those 3 plies off. Then we're going to cut the other one at about half of the length. So if you look at it now, we've got a long ply, a medium ply, and a short ply. And you can do this if you only have 2 plies, just cut 1 short, or if you've got 4, stagger them in 4 different lengths. But the idea is that now when I weave this in, it's kind of tapered. And so when I go like this and I weave it into the shed, it's just less thick, and so it's less visible. When I go to put in that next shed or the next pick, there we go. It's a little bit less visible. And you can use that when you're starting. So if this were my header and that was the first pick I put in, you can use it that way. You can use it when you're changing colors. And now let me show you a slightly different method of weaving in a tail when it's the last pick of the piece. So you probably wouldn't do this when you're just changing colors. You would do it when you're just weaving in that very last pick and then the tail that goes with it. All right, so let's look at that last pick that we wove and then the tail that we wove in. So let's imagine that we weren't changing colors, but this was really the last pick of the piece. So it is fine to just weave that in like we had done in the same shed as the last full pick. But here's something that you can do that I think locks it in better and prevents the occurrence that I see sometimes where if I've got a series of overhand knots here, this manages to kind of work its way free and hang down between the fringe knots. So I think this is a little bit more elegant solution to that. So, but it does take advanced planning. So let's say I knew that this is going to be the last full pick and then I just have my tail to weave in. So I backtrack here and I take out that last pick and I treadle for the next to last pick. So the one that was right before that, I open that shed again. And if you remember, the tail was going to weave in on this side. So I take a piece of yarn that is pretty fine and pretty smooth. And in this case, this is 8-2 Orlon, but it could be a rayon or a cotton, just something that's going to slip through the fabric pretty easily. And I'm going to put it in the shed that is the next to last shed. So I've thrown that next to last pick, then I slide this in and there's a little loop here. And then I go ahead and I throw that last full pick like that. And then you can do that tapered unply and then cut this. I'm not going to do that just to show this example, but you definitely can do that. So now I've got the little loop that I wove in here. Here's the loop. And then here's the tail that we're going to weave in. Now, this is a twill that we're weaving. And if I just send it back into the same shed, it's not going to wrap around this last thread. So I'm going to manually take it around there and then feed it through that loop. And then I'm going to pull. And that little loop is drawing it into the previous shed. And so now it's actually locked in because you have one continuous weft pick all the way across and the tail is woven in below that. And so that is, I think, a much more secure edge, and I think it is less visible. It's less likely that you'll see that little tail work its way loose. So I hope that gave you some ideas for some more elegant ways to weave in your tails. And just a reminder, there's no need to leave the tails out and then go back and weave them in with a needle. It's just slower, and this is fast and easy and means less finishing that you have to do when the piece is off the loom.